Everyone, just if you can bear with us, they are voting, as you can hear from the vote bells, so they will be starting momentarily as soon as they're done. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We were on the floor voting, and I'm sorry for the delay, but welcome to all of our distinguished guests, panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, I call this hearing to order. This hearing is entitled "The Human Rights Violations of the Islamic State." And we will have two panels of witnesses here today. Early in 2014, what was then a little-known group of transnational Sunni Islamic insurgents and terrorists burst onto the world stage. A remnant of al-Qaeda in Iraq, this group activity thrived in disaffected Sunni areas of Iraq and Syria since the U.S. military withdrawal in 2011. The group rapidly advanced through Iraq last year and dramatically expanded its territory in Syria since the beginning of last year. As it advanced, the group massacred adversaries, civilians, and surrounding combatants. Observers have reported a broad range of abuses and atrocities committed by ISIS members. Non-Muslim minority groups like Christians and Yazidis, and Iraqi Shiite and Syrian Alawite civilians, women of all sex and ethnicities, captured Iraqi and Syrian combatants, and even Sunni Arabs that opposed Islamic State rule have all become targets of the Islamic State. The group has openly singled out minority religious groups for targeting and has implemented brutal practices against women and children. It waged an open genocide against one minority religious group, the Yazidis, and threatened many others with the same prospect. After taking control of Mosul, ISIS demanded that Christians and other minorities convert to Islam or vacate the city. The destruction of the Christian community there followed. The group has bombed Shiite gathering places in Baghdad and other majority Shiite cities in order to depose the Shiite-led government in Iraq. Women have faced broad-ranging and particularly severe set of abuses. Yazidi women that were captured have been subject to systematic sexual violence and enslavement. The human trafficking of women is rampant amongst the group. Children, too, face specific and severe targeting. The Islamic State has conscripted boys and executed those perceived of retaining allegiances to rival groups. On the field of battle, the Islamic State has demonstrated no respect for international norms in its treatment of combatants and opposition forces. It has executed hundreds of Iraqi and Syrian military personnel captured during operations, frequently beheading their corpses and displaying the bodies and heads in town squares. ISIS has brutally opposed fellow Sunnis who reject their rule, executing hundreds or even thousands of Sunni tribes tribe people that have opposed the Islamic State rule. Lastly, the group has executed 3 Americans and declared war on America and our allies. The amount of human rights abuses committed by the Islamic State is ever accumulating. Congress is in the middle of a debate over a request by the President to authorize the use of military force against the terrorist group. As we consider this authorization and other policies, we must display leadership and comprehensively address the abuses and grievances of its victims. Our government must implement concrete steps to help address this situation with specific considerations for how women, children, and minorities have experienced the conflict and its ensuing human rights violations. Furthermore, we must learn from history. Sectarianism in Iraq and Syria was rampant long before ISIS was established and took control of the territory. A respect for international religious freedom must play a central role in guiding the region out of the current crisis. There's been a lot of debate recently regarding the nature of the Islamic State, whether it is indeed, or whether it has Islamic beliefs, or if it is motivated by other factors. This group has a top-down leadership. It has an ideology. It has a theology and a worldview that is uncompromising and demonstrates relentless ambition. I believe our government must correctly identify the motivations of this group and its threat to defeat it and put a stop to its unending human rights violation. The Commission would like to explore this today, along with policy tools that can mitigate human rights violations and bring about accountability, justice, and redress. And so I look forward to discussing these issues with our distinguished panelists. I want to thank all of them, the other members, for their attendance here today. And at this point, I'll yield to my co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Jim McGovern, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome all of you to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on human rights violations committed by the Islamic State. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. I apologize for the delay, as I'm sure Mr. Pitts did, but votes happened. So I want to also thank the staff for their role in organizing this hearing. What is the so-called Islamic State? What do we know about it? We know that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has been its leader since mid-2010. That last summer he assumed the mantle of caliph and declared the existence of a new Islamic caliphate. And during the last year, ISIS has expanded its control over large parts of Iraq and Syria, and now controls an area larger than the United Kingdom. It has gained territory. It is committed to brutal, systematic, and widespread attacks against Iraqi and Syrian civilians, including mass executions, sexual slavery of women and girls, forced recruitment of children, and the destruction of cultural heritage. Often these atrocities have been carried out against ethnic or religious minority communities. The rise of ISIS has deepened a human rights and humanitarian crisis that has been unfolding for years as sectarian conflict has spread throughout the region. Before the ISIS invasion, the Iraqi government was unable to provide basic services or to protect vulnerable groups, including children, women, and minorities. The last 2 years under the government of Prime Minister Maliki were a nightmare for religious and ethnic minorities and civil society at large. In Syria, we are marking the 4th anniversary of peaceful protests that were brutally repressed, initiating a devastating internal armed conflict. Major cities have been destroyed, 250,000 people live under siege, millions have been living as refugees, and the Assad regime has committed war crimes. These realities contributed to a vacuum that ISIS forces sadly exploited. At the core of my work on human rights is the fundamental belief that governments and nations are stronger and more stable if they respect the basic human rights of all their citizens in their diversity. It is especially necessary to protect the rights of minority populations and to redress discrimination. It should make no difference which minorities we're talking about. Governments that are pluralistic and inclusive offer the only alternative to permanent sectarian conflict. How do we get there? We need clear guidance and concrete steps that we can take to turn back ISIS and respond effectively. We need to establish mechanisms and institutions that genuinely embrace pluralism. In December, the Commission held a hearing on human rights and human rights in the humanitarian crisis in Iraq that generated some recommendations. To date, the U.S. has significantly scaled up the provision of humanitarian assistance and protection and has undertaken a separate active military role in Iraq to counter the Islamic State. At today's hearing, I look forward to getting additional recommendations on what the United States can do and the international community can do to alleviate these continuing human rights abuses. And finally, Mr. Chairman, we are focusing on atrocities committed by the Islamic State today. But there are many armed actors in Syria and Iraq who carry out terrible abuses and human rights crimes against the civilian population. Human Rights Watch has documented gross abuses by Iraqi government forces with its allied Shia militias against Sunnis and Sunni villages in the fight to turn back ISIS. And I want to say how deeply concerned I am about this morning's story in the Washington Post regarding reports that the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad allegedly dropped barrel bombs filled with some chemical agent, most likely chlorine, on the city of Sarmin in northwest Syria. According to medical workers in that town, at least 6 people died and over 70 others were so severely affected by this chemical agent that they required medical treatment. On March 6th, the United Nations Security Council condemned in the strongest terms any use of chlorine as a weapon in Syria. We need to make sure that the Syrian government stops using toxic chemicals as weapons, and it is up to the international community, including the United States, to ensure that this form of violence is no longer used against Syria's defenseless population. Toxic chemicals, including chlorine, are indiscriminate weapons. They do not distinguish between combatants and civilians, between soldiers and women, children, or the elderly. This is why their use is banned and condemned, and we cannot stand silently by and fail to take action against their use. And with that, I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and now recognize another distinguished member of the commission, Trent Franks, Arizona, for opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to be very candid with you. We're in the middle of a markup in another committee, and I have to go soon, so my comments will be sort of extemporaneous and very brief. But I want you to know that I am grateful to both chairmen for drawing attention to this critical issue, and would suggest to you that there's nothing that I or any of us should fear more in terms of public policy than allowing ourselves or our leaders to grow numb to evil and the horrific and barbaric atrocities perpetrated against our fellow Americans and our fellow human beings across the world. And I would suggest to you that ISIS represents probably one of the most evil groups that we have faced in modern day, and sometimes we realize that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And 7 decades ago, another evil ideology arose in the world, and some deemed them second string, or whatever you might want to add as an adjective, and they were sort of ignored. They wore brown shirts and drove bicycles across France, and nobody paid much attention to them. But they had an evil ideology that had no respect for human rights and for innocent individuals, and that ideology began to take hold in the intelligentsia of Germany, and it lit the fires of World War II's hell on earth and even Holocaust, and before it was over, atomic bombs fell on cities and 50 million people were dead. We ignore this kind of evil, lack of compassion for innocent human beings at the peril of all of us. When we don't intervene and stand between the innocent and the malevolent, we invite that evil to our own shores and that hand to knock on our own door. And so I want to encourage all of you for what you're doing. The fundamental truth is, if we don't have the courage to reach out and protect the innocent, in the final analysis, it weakens our commitment to liberty for anyone on earth. And I truly believe that if we are about protecting the innocent in our own society and the world, that we can overcome almost everything else if we have the moral impulse toward one another to try to protect the innocent. Somehow we can overcome the rest. But when we turn a blind eye to those that are suffering and tortured and crucified and beheaded and burned alive, when we turn a blind eye to that, not only does it threaten our society, it calls into question whether it's worth saving anyway. So I thank all of you for what you're doing. I especially thank the chairman here. I want you to know that many of us are involved not only in efforts like this, but in the greater effort to respond to this evil as it should be responded to. So God bless you all. Thank you, both chairmen, and let's hope and pray for a day when, like the Nazis, ISIS will be no more.
Chair thanks the gentleman for his eloquent statement. In the audience, we have a distinguished guest. I would like to take this time to welcome His Grace Bishop Angelos. His Grace is General Bishop of the Coptic Orthodox Church in the United Kingdom. He was born in Cairo. He spent his childhood and early life in Australia. Following the murders of Coptic Christians at the hands of ISIS last month, His Grace launched the, quote, "when left behind," end quote, appeal. The appeal, which will support the families of the victims, has received support from His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, and His Grace, the Archbishop of Canterbury, among others. So thank you for your presence here today, Your Grace. Now, I'd like to call the first panel to the witness stand, and I'd like to just take your seat, and I'll introduce you as you come. Our only witness on our first panel here is David Saperstein. He's the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. He was confirmed by the Senate in December of 2014. He was sworn in and assumed his duties on January 6, 2015. The Ambassador at Large is, by law, a principal advisor to the President and the Secretary of State, and serves as the United States Chief Diplomat on issues of religious freedom worldwide. Ambassador Saperstein previously served for 40 years as the Director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, overseeing the national social justice programming for the largest segment of American Jewry. A rabbi and an attorney for 35 years, Ambassador Saperstein taught seminars in First Amendment church-state law and in the Jewish law at Georgetown University Law Center. Ambassador Saperstein recently visited Iraq and has been outspoken about the urgency of dealing with unfolding violations of religious freedom around the world, particularly in Iraq and Syria. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us here today. We look forward to hearing a report of your trip and your testimony. At this time, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts and Chairman McGovern. Members of the Commission who are not here, I hope I have the opportunity to meet and talk with them about this urgent issue, and I thank you for holding this hearing to condemn ISIL's increasingly flagrant and egregious human rights abuses amongst the millions forcibly displaced in Iraq and Syria. Religious and ethnic minorities feel especially threatened by the actions of violent extremist groups such as ISIL. ISIL is pursuing its own violent, destructive interpretation of prophecies in which it plays the starring role, engaging in targeted and systematic efforts to displace entire communities from their historic homelands in Iraq and Syria. Those not ascribing to the extremist brand of Sunni Muslim ideology, including Shia Muslims, other Sunni Muslims, Alawites, Christians, Ismailis, Druze, and others, have faced mass killings, forced conversion at gunpoint, kidnappings, and other atrocities. As the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, I'm especially concerned with ISIL's promotion of a worldview fundamentally and diametrically opposed to freedom of religion. A worldview it uses to justify its violent actions. In addition, ISIL's rise and the threat it presents clearly demonstrate the strong and complex link between religious freedom and our national security. The list of ISIL's atrocities is too long to enumerate fully during this testimony. You've named many of them: the mass killings, the beheadings, crucifixion, stoning, abduction, forced conversions, torture, rape, sexual assault, enslavement, mass eviction, forced migration, burning and burying people alive, using women and children as human shields. People have been pushed off buildings and beheaded because of their sexual orientation. Women have been murdered merely for being community organizers and journalists. We were all horrified when American, Japanese, and other journalists and aid workers were beheaded, and when the Jordanian pilot, Captain Moaz al-Kasaba, was burned alive in a cage. And these horrendous acts have shocked the conscience of the world and made a mockery of the righteous image with which ISIL attempted to portray itself. Its targeting of people on the basis of religious identity cuts across more sectors of society than we often hear about in the media. When ISIL entered Mosul last June, it clearly announced on social media it would never target civilians except for those who were Shia. On the same day, ISIL took control of Camp Spiker in Tikrit and summarily executed over 1,000 unarmed Shia male Air Force cadets it had detained. Despite their claim of not targeting civilians, it wasn't long after before ISIL began systematically targeting minorities in Mosul. For example, by imposing an ultimatum on Christians to convert, be killed, pay the jizya tax. If they didn't, they simply had to flee to save their lives. And those who were unable to flee were often forced to convert at gunpoint. ISIL's offensives continued against other parts of the Nineveh plain. We saw the siege of tens of thousands of Yazidis on Mount Sinjar in early August, justified by ISIL because of how it characterized their religious beliefs. This prompted the president to order airstrikes to help forces in Iraq to break the siege, explaining, quote, "We can act carefully and responsibly to prevent a potential act of genocide. That's what we are doing on that mountain." Well, we have helped save tens of thousands of lives, but hundreds of innocents were lost, and thousands of women and children when taken into an unimaginable life of suffering, raped, enslaved, sold, or given as compensation to ISIL fighters. Talking about ISIL's abuses in Iraq would address only a fraction of what horrors they've wrought. So let me turn to Syria. The situation in Syria is especially heartbreaking because in Syria, as you alluded, ISIL is just one of many flagrant and systematic abusers of human rights. Its abuses and those by extremist groups such as the al-Nusra Front, the Assad regime arbitrarily detains tens of thousands of people each year, torturing many to their deaths. It's devastated cities such as Aleppo in a brutal, mostly barrel bombing campaign and starved towns into submission. Shia militia working in coordination with the Assad regime regularly target Sunni civilians for arbitrary killings, sometimes en masse, and al-Nusra does the same to Shia and other non-Sunnis, as well as conducting kidnappings, forced recruitment, including of children and other atrocities. And now the world's attention and ours, and everyone in this room, is focused on the most recent threat. On the morning of February 23, ISIL launched an offensive against a string of predominantly Syrian Christian villages along on one side of the Kabul River, northwest of Zahasaka city. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 people were displaced. Between 260 and 350 were taken captive. Assyrian Kurdish fighters have repelled the attackers from crossing the river to attack other villages and is still trying to hold the line there. A week after the initial attacks, 23 captives were released, but we remain gravely concerned about those who are still in captivity. And again, we have stepped up our bombings aimed at stopping ISIL, and it has helped. My team at the International Religious Freedom Office has been working hard, gathering and sharing a great deal of detailed threat information, much of which comes from the rich network of diaspora and advocacy groups, many represented in this room, with relevant U.S. departments and agencies that can take action to help. In recent days, the coalition has, as I indicated, stepped up strikes in the vicinity of Hasaka in order to degrade ISIL's presence there. And during my confirmation hearing, I made clear that the fate and well-being of vulnerable religious communities, including the Christian communities in the Near East, would be among my most urgent priorities. Accordingly, my first trip as ambassador at large took me to Iraq to see firsthand the impact ISIL had on the people of that country, meeting with representatives from nearly every religious group in the country to hear the terrible toll borne by these communities and what they needed, including many who were displaced yet poignantly wish to return home to rebuild their lives. My office has direct links with our coalition's counter-ISIL effort, which includes both a military and non-military component, to ensure that the security conditions of vulnerable populations are understood in our broader counter-ISIL effort. And we're facilitating access here in D.C. for a wide range of targeted communities, as we did for Yazidi communities, most recently for key Christian leaders with churches in Syria. And this allows senior officials to hear firsthand from those most effective about the situation afflicting members of these communities. Now, all the representatives of religious communities with whom we meet highlight the importance of defeating ISIL. We can't proceed without the work of the coalition of 60 countries aimed at degrading its capacity through coordinated airstrikes, military assistance to the groups fighting ISIL, diplomatic engagement, messaging coordination to defeat, degrade, and delegitimize it. We have spent scores of millions of dollars trying to sustain and to give support to those displaced populations. If they don't have health care and schools to send their kids, if they don't have shelter over their heads, they're not going to stay, even those who want to stay. And we have to be sure they have what it takes to hold in place until we have the opportunity of pushing ISIL out, to reconstruct life and allow them to return, those who wish to their historic homes. In Iraq, the restoration of security of all the people we meet identified it as crucially important, and as well the restoration of trust between the different segments of society and between the people and the government. Many people there felt betrayed when government forces and Kurdish forces fled when ISIL attacked. This will require stabilizing the areas. It will involve justice for those who have had their homes and their businesses taken over by others. These complicated steps of security, reconciliation, reconstruction, transitional justice are the things we talked about with Iraqi officials at the highest levels. They continue to be a central part of our work in Washington, develop strategies to deal with each one of those. At the same time, there have been disturbing and serious allegations of Shia militias, some Peshmerga forces, Yazidi fighters, and others committing revenge attacks against Sunnis when ISIL is pushed out of territory. We've called for transparent, thorough, timely investigations and have been encouraged that Prime Minister Abadi has stated that he has a zero-tolerance policy for human rights abuses. For Syria, we've been clear that our overarching goal is to help the Syrian people reach a solution that fulfills Syrian aspirations for freedom and dignity. We remain we maintain our firm belief that Assad has lost all legitimacy and must go. Syria will be necessary to ensure all perpetrators of atrocities are brought to action. To sum up, we're resolved to see an end to ISIL's violent crimes. We are committed to the important work of defending vulnerable religious communities in the region, helping survivors of ISIL's brutality. Let me pledge my commitment to work closely with this commission, with the relevant committees in this Congress. I know how many people on both sides of the aisle are dedicated to the principle of religious freedom and to prevent extremists from undermining the hopes for democracy and freedom for all the peoples in the regions where they exist. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your opening statement. I'll begin the questioning at this point. Religious minority groups in the region have at times been criticized for what detractors describe as overly close ties to the United States and Europe. How can the United States best advocate for the rights of religious minorities in Iraq and Syria without undermining the standing of these groups within their broader communities?
Mr. Chairman, I really appreciate that question and may want to suggest that at some point you might want to devote an entire hearing to this, because this challenge applies not just to this situation. Very often our efforts to embrace those who represent values, whatever their theology, I don't care how fundamentalist, how liberal their theology is, if they eschew the use of force to impose their views on others and are willing to abide by the rule of law, they should be part of the broad coalition that is aimed at defeating the violent extremists. But very often our embrace of them is used in a narrative battle for the hearts and minds of the people we hope that they will affect, to delegitimize them as not being authentic, but representing foreign interests. We have to be much more sophisticated in the way we go about our efforts in these, building intergroup and international coalitions involving Muslim countries and countries from the Southern Hemisphere who are part of these coalitions and can add legitimacy that sometimes it is difficult for us to do, and have long-standing relations often with a number of these religious communities because they may exist in their own countries in which they have successfully worked together to curtail or contain extremist efforts in their own countries. There are ways that we can empower them in the communications battle for the hearts and minds of particularly younger people within their religious communities, and it's not just Muslim extremists. We have extremist groups, violent Buddhists, militant Buddhists who are affecting Rohingya Muslims in Burma. In Sri Lanka, you have the situation of extremist Hindu groups in India. These are challenges across the globe, and we have to be to meet those people where they are, find out what they need from us, and be more sophisticated in the way we approach our efforts to help them. So I'm glad that you put this on the table, and I do hope we think about it more broadly and with deeper insight into this challenge.
Even before ISIS or ISIL's rise, the smallest religious communities, which include Catholics, Christian Orthodox, Protestant, Yazidis, Sabaean, Mandaeans, were mere shadows of their former presence. They have long faced official and societal discrimination, and their small size, their lack of militia or tribal structures have made it difficult for them to defend themselves against violence or protect their rights through the Iraqi political system. ISIL's August 2014 attack on the largely Yazidi town of Sinjar, located in the Nineveh province of northern Iraq, led to the massacre of Yazidis and Assyrian Christians, Shia, and others, and the destruction of religious sites that date back for centuries, along with other attacks, which together threaten the very existence of these religious communities. ISIL has also killed Sunni Muslims who disagree with their extremist ideology, as well as Sunni clerics that rejected their extremist ideologies or attempted to assist or protect religious minorities. My question is, what policy tools does the United States have to promote religious freedom and prevent human rights abuses by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq against these minorities?
First, we have to act on a military level to degrade, weaken, and support those ground forces that will drive ISIL out of these areas. Secondly, there need to be the ability of those communities to participate in their own security, with local security forces integrated into the broader security structure of Iraq, and the same would be true in Syria. These are, none of those groups can develop militias, can develop security forces that are going to be able to protect them alone. They have to be integrated, these local security forces, and they have to be coordinated with the Peshmerga and with the Iraqi forces as well. So that has to be another part of it. As I indicated, sustaining people who are displaced in living conditions that give them a sense of hope. Here, for the most vulnerable who don't have the elderly, orphan children, others who may not have a path to go home in any realistic kind of way, improving the visa process in the international community to try and ensure they're protected in other locations if that's necessary, can be part of that. As I said, the transitional justice, there were people who took their homes and their businesses. We have to find a way to resolve now their needs, the reconstruction economically of those areas. We know the pieces of what it will take. It will require that same coalition of 60 countries and some of the surrounding nations as well, working together to map that out. We can start right now. We're not waiting or shouldn't wait until ISIL is driven out to begin those conversations. There has to be planning. And on the ground, when we were there, we pushed very hard with our meeting with the Peshmerga military forces and the Kurdistan regional government, and with the Iraqi military, with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the interior ministers, both of the nation and Deputy Interior Minister of Iraq and the Interior Minister of Kurdistan regional government. We worked in terms of trying to see how the coordination is happening, encourage them to really develop these plans right now, as well as we know where a number of the captives are. What are we going to do to prevent them from being taken out, the ones who are in Iraq? It has to be part of the military planning as well here. all of these are pieces of what is happening, and it's what we spent our time on dealing with when we were there.
Thank you. Very, very important and informative. Chair recognizes Co-Chair Mr. McGovern for
Well,
questions.
thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's great to see you, and appreciate your lifetime of work on these issues, not only for religious freedom, but on human rights in general. So I just, this is so overwhelmingly horrible, and we read about it in the news every day, and we have human rights organizations explaining to us in vivid detail the horrors that continue to be committed by ISIS against civilian populations, against religious and ethnic minorities, and it is, it is beyond comprehension. But there's a short-term strategy, but then there's the longer-term strategy. And I guess what we hear a lot about up here is, the short-term strategy. I mean, we're bombing every day, and yet ISIS continues to get recruits. People are now talking about, deploying U.S. forces, as a way to deal with this. I mean, but you hear a lot about kind of the military options and the military solutions. But I think the long-term strategy needs to be aimed more at a political solution, because some of these governments, including the government of Iraq, before ISIS came in and began to be a presence there, the government that we left in Iraq was not a particularly inclusive government. And there were reports that ISIS came in, and there was a vacuum and exploited some of the excesses that the Iraqi government committed against Sunnis and others, and they were able to find people to, at least, if not join, to be at least tolerant of their presence. And I worry about this not just with regard to Iraq and certainly Syria, but with a lot of countries in the region. That we need a greater effort to try to encourage these governments to respect all the people, especially ethnic and religious minorities that live in their countries. And I'm trying to figure out, I'm just trying to figure out how we, first of all, try to convince people to turn away from ISIS, but also what are we doing to prevent ISIS from going to other places and exploiting populations and taking advantage of, quite frankly, bad governance by people who are oftentimes our allies.
Would it be appropriate for a diplomat to say amen?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, that absolutely, yeah.
I'm really glad you put that on the
Yeah.
table. What happened under the Maliki government testifies to the point I made in the testimony when I said there is a direct connection between our national security, the national security of other nations, and religious freedom. If large segments of the community can be systematically discriminated against, shut out of the governance structure, believe that they have no hope to fulfill their destiny through in the normative structures of that society, or even worse, forced underground for their religious beliefs, where they, as I said, creates a fertile field that extremists can often cultivate and seed and cultivate to recruit people to them. This is the classic affirmation of that failure, and therefore what we are hearing from Prime Minister Abadi, a very different style of this, a more inclusive government, a commitment to maintaining the minority communities, a commitment to protect those communities, his willingness to call the Shia militias to task that have been, fortunately, the exception, but way too frequent, excesses aimed at either the Sunni community or other communities. This is a different tone, and we need to do everything we can to support him. He has enormous pressures on all sides. This is not an easy path for him to go. And the international community, in particular, including our friends in the surrounding countries, need to stand behind him and provide him with the kind of support he needs in order to be able to create a very different kind of model. The other part of it is what I indicated. By our, think about, you can take like Hezbollah and Hamas and groups like that. How did they begin their move towards influence? In limited or failed state situations, they started providing core social services to people. Well, you don't need to have failed states to learn a lesson from that. Very often across the globe, in countries even like the United States, it is the religious communities that are providing core services we can empower a coalition of interfaith coalition of groups to work together on behalf of all the citizens and create a different model of tolerance. There have to be, and that's a long-term strategy, and there have to be long-term strategy aimed at empowering those willing to work together, those committed to a tolerant society. In the end, that's a way to delegitimize the extremists and not leave room for them to really cultivate followers. And that long-term strategy has to begin now, not later once things are militarily stabilized, but right now.
Because when I look at the region, sometimes I'm reminded it was that Dr. Seuss book, Cat in the Hat, you know? We clean up one mess and we create a bigger mess. We clean up that mess, it gets bigger, and, you know, it just goes on and on and on and on. And when I'm, you know, I've been around here now since 1996, and I feel that sometimes some of the best intentions or things that we've engaged in that part of the world have not resulted in the goal that was promised. And so I do think that, you know, we need to be thinking, you know, again, there's the short term and then there's the long term. And if we don't get the long term right, we're just going to we'll clean up one mess and create a bigger mess. I think that's what happened in Iraq. I mean, no one likes Saddam Hussein, but we ended up with a government that was not a good government. And in Afghanistan, we've invested all this time and money and the sacrifice of young men and women, and we have a government that is pretty corrupt. And it's like if we get involved in these places, I think we need to be assured that, you know, things are going to be better off for people when it's done than not. And I don't. And again, I think I agree with everything you're saying here, but we've spent millions on humanitarian assistance. Is it enough? Is it flexible enough? You mentioned transitional justice. Is this prosecutions, or is it alternative justice, or women victims? What are we doing? What do they need? Assad must go, but do we need him to fight ISIS? And now we're involved with a nuclear deal with Iran, and they're fighting ISIS, and it's all very confusing. But at the end of the day, I worry about that. A lot of the people that we need to care for, are kind of afterthoughts.
Well, I appreciate that. You're going to hear from a very strong panel of people who have given a lot of thought to some of these issues as well. But in terms of the justice part of it, there has to be immediate justice, criminal justice for those who directly engaged in the atrocities that were involved. And that means within Iraq, and in some cases within the international community as well. But for those communities that have to, because of their passivity to allow this to happen and stand idly by, have left deep scars from people who have long been their neighbors, there we need a different kind of justice that will be, as you said, alternative, aimed at reconciliation, but at fairness in terms of allowing people to have restoration of what they lost because they were forced to flee in this area, but done in a way that promotes reconciliation. These are both short-term and long-term goals that we're challenged with.
And just one final quick question, because we're now very much engaged in all of this, and yet you read reports that ISIS is growing in recruits. I guess the question is, what can we doing? What should we in the international community be doing better to mitigate the appeal of the group?
First, there's some indication that their recruiting actually is flattened out or decreasing at this time, and the international community's efforts to respond to this is having an impact. At the State Department, there is a very high-level task force of some of the most skilled and thoughtful analysts and communications experts aimed at dealing just with these questions. What are the messages? What are the messages that can help undercut the legitimacy of the group? What are the needs of the people they are appealing to that we, through international cooperation, can address in ways that may be far more effective than anything that ISIL can offer them? There's a lot of thought going on with this. It is true not just here, but across the globe. The recent emergency summit called by the president to combat violent extremism was filled with creative ideas that are going on all across the globe, from local communities across the globe, aimed at trying to answer the question that you've put on the table. And from the best practices that came out of that are a rich repository of new ideas that are being forged and plans made as to how to implement those kinds of strategies. So there are some encouraging signs in this area, but in the end, and that's why I said the question of how you support here, the broader coalition committed to the rule of law and eschewing the use of force to impose their views on each other, how you empower them and allow them to stand up themselves in their own terms, not our Western terms necessarily, their own terms to effectively respond to the extremism is one of the central challenges we face in American foreign policy. We are making progress on it. Here, it will continue to be a significant challenge in the years to come that we must respond to.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad you're where you are. So
Well,
thank you.
it's been good to can't think of
Yeah.
two people who stand more for the values of human rights and religious freedom than the two of you, and I'm deeply honored to have been with you.
And again, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your concern, for your efforts in this regard, for your trip to the region. We look forward to working with you. If we have any follow-up questions, can we send them to you in writing?
Of course you
And
can.
fine.
I'll be honored.
Some of
to
the other
respond.
members who are late probably will have some. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. At this time, I'll ask the second panel to take the witness stand and ask the staff to put out their placards. This is a very diverse panel. Some of them have traveled many miles to be here present today, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will present testimony. First, Mr. Sanjeev Berry is the Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA. His commentaries on U.S. foreign policy and human rights have appeared in a range of U.S. newspapers and publications. Sanjeev holds a BA from UC Berkeley and an MPA from Harvard Kennedy School, where he was a Harvard Public Service Fellow. He is a recipient of the 2007 Asian Law Alliance Community Impact Award and has received commendations from the California State Senate and Assembly for his human rights advocacy. So, Mr. Berry, if you can take your seat next to him, please come to the witness stand. Mr. Evers, Mr. Aaron Evers is an Iraqi researcher. Ms. Evers is an Iraqi researcher with Human Rights Watch. Ms. Evers received her JD from Yale Law School, where she was editor of the Yale Human Rights and Development Law Journal in 2011. From 2006 to 2011, Ms. Aaron was an advocate with the Allard K. Lowenstein International Human Rights Law Clinic at Yale Law School. She's also a recipient of the postgraduate Robert Bernstein Fellowship for International Human Rights. Welcome, Ms. Evers. Thirdly, Rami Abdurrahman is director of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights based in London. His group cooperates with human rights organizations throughout Syria and the region to document human rights abuses. His organization's efforts have been reported by media outlets throughout the world, have been recognized by many organizations, including such bodies as the United Nations. And finally, Bassam Ishaq is president of the Syriac National Council of Syria. He's been a long-time political reform and human rights activist in Syria. Before and after the civil conflict, he is an Orthodox Syrian Christian and ran for parliament in Syria twice, but was not granted the right to serve. When in Syria, he was director of the Syrian Human Rights Organization. Welcome. To all of you, thank you very much for your patience today and taking time to come here. Mr. Barry, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Pitts. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, both of you for your leadership on human rights issues. Amnesty International USA has long considered it a privilege to work with both of you, and our membership across the U.S. deeply appreciates the work that you've done on quite a wide range of human rights issues that we're all concerned about, including the ones today. The rise of the armed group calling itself Islamic State, as well as the broader human rights crises in Iraq and Syria, represent a tangled knot of geopolitics and extraordinary human suffering that evades a simple answer. Today I join my esteemed colleagues on this panel in helping to define the problem and highlight key components of the solution. Amnesty International has documented firsthand the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Islamic State and many of the parties to this conflict. These include the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Syrian government, abuses committed by some of the 1,500 armed groups in Syria, violations by the Iraqi government, abductions and killings by Shia militias, and even abuses including revenge attacks by Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers. March 15th marked the 4th year of Syria's crisis. It's worth remembering that before the armed group Islamic State arrived on the scene, there were many long months in which civilians suffered crimes against humanity committed by the Syrian government and extensive war crimes and gross human rights abuses by government forces and some armed groups. It wasn't until late 2012 that the Islamist armed groups with their radical interpretations of Sharia began establishing areas of military dominance. In 2014, Islamic State swept across northern Iraq. Over the ensuing months, IS carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing in which countless Iraqi religious minorities were given the choice of leaving, converting, or being enslaved or killed. Because of IS and other violence, more than 2 million Iraqis were displaced during 2014. Nearly half of them, some 950,000, are now in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Hundreds and possibly thousands of Yazidi women and girls have been forcibly married, sold, or given as quote-unquote gifts to IS fighters or their supporters. Through private negotiations, some Yazidi women and girls were able to return to their families, but many remain trapped in horrifying circumstances of sexual violence and sexual slavery. In Syria, Amnesty International has documented IS prison camps where sentences are handed down by Islamic State judges following reports of torture and forced confessions. Meanwhile, the larger refugee crisis stemming from the armed conflict in Syria continues unabated. 7 million people are internally displaced in Syria, and 4 million are refugees who have fled the country. Collectively, these challenges evade a simple solution, but there are key steps that U.S. policymakers can take to reduce suffering and to begin to address the human rights crisis. In terms of recommendations, policies pursued by the U.S. must prioritize the present and future protection of civilians. This is in order to ensure that U.S. actions do not run the risk of either making the problem worse or of introducing new factors that could trigger future human rights crises. In my submitted written testimony, I addressed the following areas of concern: U.S. military action, U.S. military assistance, refugees and internally displaced people, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as the questions of investigation, prosecution, and accountability. With the remainder of my time, I want to focus on the two questions of U.S. military action and U.S. military assistance. First, U.S. military action. Amnesty International's focus is on holding all parties in an armed conflict to their binding obligations under international law. We take no position on the question of military intervention per se. In situations of armed conflict, we focus on ensuring full respect for the rules of international humanitarian law, what are called the laws of war, and applicable human rights law. In terms of ongoing U.S. combat and military operations in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. should take all reasonable precautions to prevent death or injury to civilians. Any airstrikes authorized by the U.S. in either Syria or Iraq should be strictly limited to bona fide military targets. Congress is presently engaged in a debate over a potential new authorization to use military force, or AUMF. Though such an AUMF might be proposed in the context of the U.S. armed conflict with Islamic State, Congress should be mindful of the following human rights concerns: sweeping grants of war authority, including for military actions against vaguely defined quote-unquote associated persons or quote-unquote associated forces, could further entrench the U.S. in a permanent global war framework without identifiable geographic or temporal limits in which broad executive discretion and secrecy are the rule. Now to turn to the second question of U.S. military assistance. Without adequate safeguards, U.S. arms transfers and military assistance in Syria and Iraq could lead to additional human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. This is because key U.S. allies in the armed conflict with Islamic State have highly problematic human rights records of their own. In the armed conflict with Islamic State in 2014, the Iraqi central government used indiscriminate shelling in Fallujah, including on hospitals and in residential areas. Meanwhile, Shia militias affiliated with the Iraqi government have waged bloody campaigns of kidnapping and murder targeting primarily Sunni communities. Given these realities, it is problematic that legislation recently passed by Congress and signed into law by the President enables the White House to waive important monitoring and human rights screening requirements for recipients of U.S. arms and military training in Iraq and Syria. Congress must closely monitor how the Obama administration provides military aid, assistance, and training, and to who. If U.S. weapons end up being used by others to commit war crimes and human rights abuses, the U.S. risks perpetuating the underlying political problems that facilitated the rise of armed groups like Islamic State to begin with. In summary, the terrible human rights record of the armed group Islamic State is best understood within the broader context of the long-term impunity that governments and armed groups alike have enjoyed for grave and widespread abuses in both Syria and Iraq. Any lasting solution to this human rights crisis must elevate the protection of civilians to a top priority. Any political solution must prioritize human rights principles in order to be a long-term success. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize Ms. Evers for opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the Lantos Commission, thank you for inviting me to testify this afternoon. It is a great pleasure to be here. Per your request, I would like to share some insights from my experience and research in Iraq. I will describe some of the abuses that I've documented as Human Rights Watch's Iraq researcher, specifically by the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. I will also discuss widespread violations of international human rights and humanitarian law that pro-government militias, Iraqi security forces, and volunteer fighters are carrying out in Iraq, without which a discussion about ISIS's atrocities would be glaringly incomplete. Finally, I offer some recommendations for U.S. foreign policy in Iraq going forward. I'll start off with what we've documented, the abuses that ISIS has committed in the past couple of years in Iraq, focusing specifically on Iraq. Much of this has been discussed by the people in the room already, but I'll talk specifically about attacks on minorities. We documented ISIS's abduction of Shia Turkmen from areas near Mosul, ISIS killing, kidnapping religious and ethnic minorities in and around Mosul, seizing Turkmen, Shabaks, and Yazidis, ordering Christians to convert to Islam, and separating women and girls from their families and forcing some into marriage. As my colleague Mr. Berry just said, being sold or given as gifts to ISIS fighters. We've documented multiple rapes and sexual slavery. Last summer, we documented the massacre at Camp Speicher, in which ISIS took control of Tikrit on June 11th, claimed to have executed 1,700 Shia members of the army, posted videos of hundreds in civilian clothes who had claimed had surrendered at the nearby Speicher military base. We located 5 of the execution sites and confirmed that at least between 560 and 770 people were killed. The number is likely much higher. Finally, we documented how ISIS gunmen systematically executed some 600 male inmates outside Mosul at the Badouche prison on June 10th when it took over Mosul. The vast majority of these prisoners were Shia. Next, I'm going to focus on security forces and militia abuses, within which I think the problem of ISIS has to be contextualized, as the ambassador and Mr. Berry have already noted. Without a discussion of the previous government's egregious abuses and the ongoing abuses by security forces and militia abuses, we can't understand, where ISIS is at today and why they have the kind of power that they have today. On March 11th, ABC documented atrocities by Iraqi security forces in addition to militias. These are official security forces that the U.S. Created and trained. We at Human Rights Watch reviewed the entire compilation. before the report was aired. Basically, these images showed graphic evidence of Iraqi forces torturing and summarily executing civilians, including children, and beheading captives. These are all abuses that we have been documenting for the past several years under former Prime Minister Maliki's government, and that we have continued to document since Abadi took over the premiership. Today, we released a report on the abuses by Shia militias of Sunni civilians in and around Amerli after Iraqi security forces, militias, with the aid of U.S. airstrikes, routed ISIS from Amerli. The Amerli operation was touted as a great victory, as a great success, but the story of what happened afterwards shows that it was in fact a human rights disaster. We interviewed, my colleague and I, dozens, more than 30 people in Salahuddin and Kirkuk provinces, analyzed photo and satellite imagery showing militias, not ISIS, destroyed Sunni villages in whole or in part, forced the displacement of thousands of residents, and kidnapped civilians, apparently to remove Sunni civilians from the area permanently. We are gravely concerned that circumstances around the Amerli operations are emblematic of an effort underway elsewhere as Iraq scales up its counterterrorism campaign, whereby Shia militias use the counterterrorism effort as an excuse to punish the Sunni population because of its sect. These militias are now leading the fight into Crete. Back in August, a massacre took place at the Musab bin Umair Mosque in Diyala, in which 34 people were killed. We interviewed victims of this massacre who were in the mosque and watched as pro-government militias and security forces entered and opened fire. They watched as these militias and security forces killed their relatives. The Iraqi government has yet to make public any investigation results into the massacre at the mosque in Diyala, and has failed to hold anybody accountable. We've documented how militias were kidnapping and killing Sunni civilians throughout Iraq's Baghdad, Diyala, and Hilla provinces throughout 2014. Finally, I offer some recommendations going forward. What can we do in terms of our foreign policy, our relationship with Iraq, in order to address the entirety of the problem? Because as we've seen so far, ISIS has only been radicalized and strengthened by the abusive tactics that the Iraqi security forces and militias have undertaken. Human Rights Watch believes that U.S. arms are effectively aiding abusive militias and security forces, and that until the Iraqi government can show it can control security forces and dismantle militias, there is simply no guarantee that U.S. aid is not helping to fuel abuses. Any ongoing U.S. military aid to Iraq should therefore be conditioned on immediate and concrete steps to end security forces and pro-government militias' commission of widespread war crimes, documentation that political reform benchmarks have been met, including the end to the use of anti-terrorism legislation to detain political opposition figures. Congress should press the administration to develop clear policy guidance on how diplomats and military officers can promote Iraqi accountability. And finally, both the Iraqi and the U.S. governments urgently need to come up with a post-conflict policy for reconstruction, including guarantees that people will be allowed to return home and to confront sectarian violence. Thank you very much again for allowing me to testify today.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognize Mr. Ishaq for your opening statement.
Chairman Pitts, Chairman McGovern, and members of the Commission, thank you for inviting me to testify about the human rights violations committed by the Islamic State, ISIS, against Assyrian Syriac Christians and other religious minorities. I speak on behalf of millions of Assyrian Christians and other religious and ethnic minorities as President of the Syriac National Council for Syria, a coalition of 13 Syriac political and civil society organizations and independent politicians who represent their interests in Syria and abroad. My remarks today will focus on the ISIS attacks on Assyrian Christians living in the 30 small villages along the Khabur River in the Al-Hasaka province of Syria that began 3 weeks ago. I will describe the political and military situation in the area, the current emergency, and our request to the US government for military and humanitarian assistance so that the Syriac military self-defense forces can repel ISIS and Christians can remain in this area where their Assyrian ancestors have lived for over 5,000 years. The province of Al-Hasaka is landlocked in northeastern Syria due to ISIS advances and political barriers. Bordered on two sides by Iraq and Turkey, it is unable to use those borders to supply its needs or to allow way to escape for civilian populations. It is cut off from the rest of Syria by ISIS armies, which have seized the neighboring provinces of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. Al-Hasaka population of almost 1.5 million includes Syrians of diverse ethnic and religious identities, Arabs and Kurdish Muslims, Syriac Christians, Armenians, Yazidis, and other ethnic and religious groups. Syriacs in Al-Hasaka were divided in 2011 between supporters and opposition to the Assad regime. Many participated in the early anti-Assad demonstrations. Later, some of the Syrian Islamists who were released from the state jails by the Assad regime returned to their home province of Al-Hasaka. Those Islamists soon dominated the opposition early peaceful demonstrations in Al-Hasaka and pushed out Christian Syriac participants. By mid-2012, an Arab tribal gang began a campaign of carnage, threats, and kidnappings that targeted wealthy residents of the city of Al-Hasaka. As a result, thousands of Syriac families have fled the region, particularly wealthier families who could afford to do so. For example, in a matter of months, 200 Syriac Assyrian medical doctors fled from the city of Al-Hasaka, and 3 major hospitals were closed. Moreover, young Syriac men who faced draft by the Assad military also fled the country. As a result of the security void, the remaining Syriacs in Al-Hasaka organized their own self-defense police. They called it Sotoro, and it means in Aramaic security. And then the Syriac Military Council was also established as a military defense against ISIS. In addition, in 2013, Syriac political forces negotiated with local Kurdish political groups led by the Democratic Union Party, PYD, and local Arab figures a social contract. The new contract established a pluralistic and inclusive political structure for governing, called the Democratic Self-Administration. The new social contract also recognized the Syriac language as one of the official languages of the province. It also provided for equal rights for all, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or gender. Al-Hasaka became a target of ISIS in 2014, attacking from the provinces of Raqqa to the west and Deir ez-Zor to the south. ISIS seized Arab villages near the regional capital city of Al-Hasaka and attacked the city before its well-known attack assault on Kobani. The People Protection Unit of the Democratic Self-Administration District, made up of Kurdish, Arab, and Syriac Assyrian military units, managed to hold them off at the time. On February 23rd, ISIS launched a surprise attack on lightly guarded villages along the Khabur with heavy weapons and many troops. It immediately kidnapped 278 women, children, and turned 30 young women as sex slaves, and executed all captured Assyrian fighters. They were about 15. There has been continuous fierce fighting for 3 weeks across the Khabur River. to keep ISIS from capturing the strategically located town of Tel Tamer. The self-defense forces have minimal weapons and many have been killed. Nonetheless, they are courageously fighting against ISIS. ISIS inflicted upon the first 10 Assyrian villages it captured its non-treatment of Christians. For example, in the village of Tel Hermes, ISIS fighters summoned elders of the community and informed them that crosses must be removed from the church of Bithyan and all churches in nearby villages. The radical group also bombed the ancient Assyrian church of Qabr Shamia in the countryside of Tel Tamer, causing the death of 4 Syriac Christian fighters who were defending the church. They basically died because they ran out of ammunition. In fighting for control of Tel Tamer, they seized the Saint Sarsis church and burned its Bibles and broke its crosses. 2 Assyrian Christians from the Ghabish village were accused by ISIS of cooperation with the Kurds, and they were executed. More than 1,000 Assyrian families fled ISIS and sought refuge in the cities and districts of the province, such as the city of Hasakeh, Qamishli, and Malikiya district. Heavy U.S.-led coalition airstrikes on through February 23rd to 27 had a major impact in slowing ISIS advancement. But when air attacks briefly stopped from February 28 to March 13, ISIS managed to build a ford along the Khabur River and cross to the northern bank, and it captured 4 more villages. And ISIS has been attempting since to encircle and capture the strategic city of Tel Tamer. On the ground, Syria, Kurdish, and local self-defense military units are being severely pressured by these larger and better equipped ISIS forces attacking from many directions. Their ammunition is limited. They need immediate and prolonged airstrike, as well as military supplies and logistical and military support to hold the ISIS advance and allow them to attempt to reclaim the lost Assyrian villages. Renewed airstrikes on March 13 and 14 raised the morals of the Assyrian Syriac fighters and their allies and have comforted terrified civilian populations. However, all on the ground realize that without a greater and continuing help, they are doomed. If ISIS was to succeed in taking the rest of Al-Hasakeh province, Christians, Kurds, and other minorities stand to receive severe persecution at best. We have specific needs and requests which we have been presenting to the UN Permanent Security Council members and also to the European Union and European Parliament, and here during our visit to Washington, D.C. First, it is imperative that the US-led coalition commit to ongoing airstrikes and other types of military assistance to our self-defense military units. They urgently need heavier weapons, ammunition, communication equipment, and coordination capabilities with the coalition, as well as food, water, and other necessities of life. We believe that this region warrants outside government conduct of military action to defend civilian population because the Assad regime is unable or unwilling to protect them, and they are under imminent threat of an ISIS genocide. Syria's sovereignty over the region has already been abandoned to ISIS. We urge the House of Representatives to use its appropriation power and its ability to issue resolution to urge the US government and the UN to take these actions. We have visited with missions of the most permanent members of the UN Security Council and asked for a resolution that establishes interim protected area in Al-Hasakeh province. Second, we urgently need humanitarian assistance because Al-Hasakeh is cut off from food and other type of supplies by blockades on the Turkish and Iraqi sides. Receiving supplies through ISIS-held area is out of the question. Large current refugee population need food, water, and shelter. If more have to flee from ISIS, we need assistance so that they can cross borders and find safe havens. Third, our long-term goal as Syriac is to be able to live in peace in our native land under a government similar to that created by the social contract for self-administration. As minorities, we have a great motivation to live in an inclusive society that is not dominated by any one group. To achieve this, Assyrians and other minorities must survive and must be able to live in the country without fearing for their lives, property, and futures. We will need considerable help with rebuilding our communities, bringing about justice and the rule of law, and creating new institutions when this conflict finally ends. In closing, on behalf of the people of Al-Hasakah province, men and women of all the nationalities and religions, I thank the United States and its coalition partners for what they have done to date to slow down ISIS attack on the province. And I humbly request that the members of this commission and the United States Congress do all within their power to keep ISIS from taking more of this territory and help afflicted civilian populations by providing crucially needed military and humanitarian assistance as quickly as possible to stop what will otherwise be a disaster for all who live in the region. Thank you.
Chair, thanks. Gentleman now recognizes Mr. Abdel Rahman for his opening statement.
شكرا للسيدين الرئيسين جوزيف وجيمس.
Thank you for the two co-chairs, Mr. Joseph. Thank you very much for the two co-chairs, Joseph Pitts and as well as James McGovern.
شكرا لهيئة تومس لانتوس لحقوق الإنسان على عقدها هذه الجلسة التي تأتي في وقت مهم للغاية بالنسبة لبلد سوريا.
Thank you for Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding this meeting, which comes at a very important time for my country, Syria.
قبل 4 سنوات من تاريخ اليوم تحول اعتصام سلمي في المسجد العمري وسط مدينة درعا القديمة.
4 years before today's date, a peaceful protest started from the Omari Mosque in Dar'a Old City Center
إلى ساحة لتنفيذ حكم الإعدام بحق مدنيين طالبوا بالكرامة ورفع حالة الطوارئ ودولة القانون وإطلاق سراح أطفال أبرياء كانت تهمتهم كتابة شعارات مناهضة للنظام على جدار مدرستهم.
A peaceful protest started from the Omari Mosque in Dar'a Old City Center. It turned to a yard to carry out the death sentence against the civilians who demanded dignity and the cancellation of the state emergency, who also asked for the rule of law and the release of innocent children who were charged for writing anti-regime slogans on the wall of their school.
في ذلك الوقت كان هناك قاتل واحد هو النظام السوري.
At that time, there was only one killer, the regime of Syria.
وكانت الضحية موحدة هي الشعب السوري.
And the victim was only one victim. It was the Syrian people.
اليوم وبعد 4 سنوات من تلك الثورة العفوية
Now, 4 years after that spontaneous revolution,
لا يقتل السوريون بالرصاص فقط،
Syrians are not only killed with bullets,
بل أن هناك من يستهدف هويتهم،
rather there are those who are targeting their identity.
إرثهم، تاريخهم، والرابطة التي جمعتهم طوال العقود
There are
الماضية.
those who are targeting their identity, their heritage, their history, and the bond that puts them together.
اليوم يعيش السوريون بين نيران النظام السوري وما يسمى تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية.
Now, the Syrians are living between the regime's fire and what is called the Islamic State.
باعتبارهما الطرفين الأبرز في المعادلة السورية، بالإضافة إلى آخرين يرون أن لهم حقا لانتزاع لا تنازع فيه في سوريا.
As the two most prominent parties in the Syrian equation, and of course there are other actors who see and think that they have an uncontested right to do what they are doing in Syria.
أيها السيدات والسادة،
Ladies and gentlemen,
هل تعلمون ما هي اللعبة المفضلة لدى أطفال بلد سوريا اليوم؟
do you know what the favorite game is for Syria's children today?
إنها لعبة الإعدام الميداني.
It is the game of field execution,
يقوم الأطفال فيها بتغطية عيونهم بقطعة قماش.
where the children play, and when they play, This game, they cover their eyes with a piece of cloth,
ويجلسون على الأرض فيما يقوم أحد أصدقائهم بإطلاق النار من مسدس خشبي.
and they sit on the ground. At the same time, another of their of other kids would shoot at them with a wooden pistol
فيسقطون أرضا متظاهرين بالموت.
on their heads, and then they fall to the ground pretending to be dead.
إنها اللعبة التي تعلموها بفضل إعلام تنظيم الدولة
It's
الإسلامية.
the game that they have learned thanks to the media of the Islamic State.
هناك دلائل متزايدة على أن التنظيم يركز جهوده على الأطفال.
There are growing pieces of evidence that prove that ISIS focuses its efforts on children
في المناطق التي يسيطر عليها
in the areas that are under their control
من أجل إعدادهم لمعاركه المستقبلية.
in order to train them for their future battles.
ما نراه في سوريا اليوم
What we see in Syria today
يتعدى مسألة الاستعانة بالأطفال في حالات محدودة.
is beyond merely using children in limited cases.
فمع تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية
When it comes to Islamic State,
رصد المرصد السوري لحقوق الإنسان
the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has monitored
إرسال التنظيم لكتيبة مؤلفة من نحو 140 عنصراً أطفال.
that the organization sends a brigade made up of 140 members under the age who are children.
إلى جبهات القتال في مدينة عين العرب
They
كوباني.
send them to the battlefield on the front line in Kobani.
كما شاهدنا مؤخراً شريطين مصورين
We have also recently seen 2 videos
تم تصويرهما على الأرجح في سوريا
that were probably filmed in Syria,
يقوم فيهما طفلان من أبناء المهاجرين
where 2 children, sons of immigrants,
بإطلاق النار على رأس 3 معتقلين من التنظيم.
opened fires on the heads of 3 of the organization's detainees.
الأمر لا يقتصر على هذا،
But not only this,
فالتنظيم يقوم عادة بعمليات الإعدام والذبح والصلب والقتل والرمي.
the organization usually conducts death penalty, slaughter, crucifixion, killing,
والرمي من فوق أسطح البنايات والرجم
throwing people from rooftops
أمام
and
جمهور
stoning
كبير غالبيته من
in
الأطفال.
front of a large crowd, mostly made up of children.
السادة الأعضاء الهيئة الموقرين،
Honorable members of the Commission,
إلى جانب الأطفال فإن المرأة هي الخاسر الأكبر من تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية.
in addition to the children, women are the biggest losers because of the behavior of the Islamic State.
وعلى عدة مستويات،
And this is at many levels.
أبرزها حالة السبي حيث أصبحت سوريا ساحة لبيع النساء.
Most notably is the case of captivity, where Syrian women have become, where Syria has become an arena for women's sale.
وخصوصا النساء من الطائفة الأيزيدية اللواتي تم سبيهن بعد اجتياح التنظيم مناطق جبل سنجار.
Especially Yazidi women who were taken captive after ISIS invasion of the areas around Jabal Sinjar.
الأمر لا يقتصر على اليزيديات،
But this is not only limited to the
But-
Yazidi women.
بل طال النساء من المسلمات السنيات،
That Muslim Sunni women are part of it too.
حيث وثقنا 6 حالات سبي على الأقل لنساء تم سبيهن من المساكن العسكرية لمقاتلين النظام في الرقة.
We have documented at least 6 cases of captivity of at least 7 women who were grabbed from military housing of the regime.
أيها السيدات والسادة،
Ladies and gentlemen,
الأقليات
when it comes to minorities,
كانت هدفا التنظيم المتشدد
this extremist organization ISIS,
بدءا من الكرد الذين يخوضون حربا ضروسا على طول جبهة تمتد نحو 400 ميل مع
Has-
مقاتلي التنظيم الدولة
has
الإسلامية.
targeted different kinds of minorities, starting from the Kurds who are engaged in a fierce war along the front stretch towards about 400 miles with the Islamic State fighters.
وقد أظهر التنظيم في عدة مناسبات
The ISIS has also shown on several occasions,
كيف ستكون حالات الأقليات في حال سيطرته على مناطقهم.
shows how the situation of minorities is going to be in case it controls their areas.
فأعدم مواطنين من الطائفتين العلوية والإسماعيلية بحجة أنهم مرتدون.
They executed members from the Alawite sect and also from the Ismaili sect under the pretext that they are apostates.
أما المسيحيون فقد صودرت ما تبقى من كنائسهم في المنطقة
As for the Christians, their property in the area has been confiscated.
وأنزلت الصلبان منها
The crosses were taken down.
وسرقت مكتباتها التاريخية
Historical libraries were also stolen,
وتم إحراق ما لا يمكن حمله منها.
and that which was not taken was set on fire.
أيها السيدات والسادة،
Ladies and gentlemen,
يخطئ من يظن أن تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية يستهدف الأقليات والمرأة فحسب.
wrong is he who thinks that the Islamic State is only targeting minorities and women.
أكثر من قتل على يد التنظيم هم المسلمون السنة.
Most of those people who were killed by ISIS are Sunni Muslims.
وما مجزرة قبيلة الشعيطات التي تنتشر في دير الزور إلا دليل على ذلك.
And the massacre of Al-Saytat tribe, which is spread in their Azor, is proof of that.
هجر عشرات الآلاف من أبناء هذه القبيلة ومنعوا من العودة إلى منازلهم.
More than 900 people died, and thousands were made to leave their homes.
أيها السيدات والسادة،
Ladies and gentlemen,
تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية يمنع الطلاب في مناطقه من الذهاب إلى مناطق سيطرة النظام أو سيطرة المعارضة.
the Islamic State prevents the transmission of students from areas under its control to areas controlled by the opposition or the regime.
وغالبا ما يقوم مقاتليه بتمزيق البطاقات الخاصة بهؤلاء الطلاب.
The fighters of ISIS also often confiscate or tear up students' cards.
كما يستخدم تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية
ISIS also uses
سلاحا آخر
another weapon
من أجل أن يكون الخيار الوحيد للسوريين هو الانضمام إلى صفوفه.
so that the only option that is given to the people is for them to join its ranks.
ألا وهو التجويع.
And this weapon is starvation.
ووثق نشطاء المرصد السوري لحقوق الإنسان بالمعلومات
The activists of the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights have documented
قيام التنظيم بإغداق الرواتب الجيدة على مقاتليه
have documented information that shows that ISIS pays excellent salaries to its
فيما
fighters,
يحرم السوريون من أبسط حقوقهم.
whereas the majority of Syrian citizens are denied their basic rights.
جميعنا تابع مؤخرا
Of course, we all recently followed
تدمير آثار الموصل.
what happened in terms of destruction of the historical sites of Mosul.
والتقارير الواردة بشأن تدمير نمرود والحضر وتدمير جامع النبي يونس في الموصل.
And there are reports and there is information that shows the destruction of the Prophet Yunus Mosque in Mosul
كل هذا كان قمة جبل الجليد.
and the destruction of Nimrod and Al-Hada areas, but all of this has been nothing but the tip of the iceberg.
لكن التنظيم بدأ في سوريا بإزالة كل ما له علاقة بذاكرة الشعب السوري.
But ISIS, the organization, has begun to remove everything that has to do with the memory of the Syrian people.
وما يثير الانتباه
What draws attention
أن الخطوة الأولى في تمدد هذا التنظيم في سوريا هي المزارات والأضرحة التي تعد الهدف الأول لمقاتليه.
is the first step, which shows that the organization destroys shrines and mausoleums, which is the first goal of the fighters of ISIS.
أيها السيدات والسادة، هذا جانب قليل مما فعله تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية خلال عامين بأبناء بلد سوريا.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is very little of what the organization has done to the children of my country, Syria.
من قتل وتهجير وتشريد وإعدام وسبي وتجميع وتدمير لإرثه الحضاري والتاريخي.
Counting, killing, displacing, executing, captivity, starving, destroying the culture and historical legacy.
وزرع الطفولة في بلدي بالمفخخات والعبوات الناسفة.
Planting explicit devices against the children of my country.
والإعدام والصلب.
Executions, crucifixion.
حتى بات المواطن في بلدي لا يأمن على نفسه ولا على عائلته ولا على أطفاله مما يفعل هذا التنظيم.
To the point that the citizens of my country are no longer safe for their safety from this organization.
فحين أعلن تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية منتصف عام 2014 أنه سيزول حدود ساكس بيكو.
When the Islamic State announced mid-year 2014 that it will remove the Sykes-Picot borders,
لم يكن عناصر هذا التنظيم وقيادته يقصدون حدود وهمية أو خطوط وهمية رسمت على خارطة في كتب الجغرافيا.
The organization's members and its leaders did not mean fake lines painted on the map of geography books.
بل أن الأمر خطير جدا.
But the fact is, this is very serious matter.
يتضمن تدمير وإزالة كل شيء.
It involves the destruction and removal of everything.
بدءا بشخصية الطفل السوري.
Starting from the character of the Syrian child.
مرورا بماضي وحاضر ومستقبل السوريين والعلاقات التاريخية بين مكوناته.
Passing by the past and the present and the future of the Syrians and historical relations between the components.
لقد قام تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية بإعدام وصلم وذبح ورجم ورمي وسحل نحو 1300 مدني سوري.
The Islamic State executed, crucified, slaughtered, stoned more than 1,300 civilians in Syria
منذ إعلان ما اسمه دولة الخلافة
since the announcement of what they called the Caliphate state
منتصف العام الماضي.
in the middle of last year.
يضاف إلى ذلك المئات من المقاتلين المعارضين له
Add to that the hundreds of opponents, of
بما
fighters
بي-
who are opposed to it,
بما فيهم جبهة النصرة وقوات النظام.
including Al-Nusra Front and regime force.
هذه الأرقام أفرحت المتحدث باسم تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية أبو محمد العدناني
These figures rejoiced and made the leader or the spokesperson of the organization, Muhammad al-Adnani, happy.
أن هذه الأعمال دليل على أن ما قامت به هذه العصابة هي
So these actions that this gang has perpetrated is proof that
هي دولة الخلافة التي أعيد إقامتها من جديد وفق هذا التنظيم.
who committed this is actually the Islamic State, which have been set up all over again.
أيها الحضور،
Dear attendants,
إنها ليست سوريا التي خرجنا من أجلها.
this is not the Syria we left.
إنها ليست سوريا التي نريد أن نسلمها لأطفالنا وأحفادنا
It's not the Syria we want to hand over to our children and grandchildren
الذين يحتاجون مساعدتكم
who need your help
أكثر من أي وقت مضى.
more than ever before.
فلا تتركوهم لوحدهم في مواجهة آلة القتل.
So please do not leave them alone in the face of the killing machine.
شكرا سيدي.
Thank you.
Well, let me thank you all very much for your testimony. I have a few questions. I know you've been here for a long time, but just and anybody can answer these, or all of you can answer them, whoever feels comfortable. But I think for a lot of us, not just in the Congress, but all around the world, who are horrified by what's going on, we're trying to figure out, like, what is the best way to combat ISIS, and I guess I'd be curious to hear your views on what do you assess are the Islamic State's greatest vulnerabilities. What more can the U.S. or coalition partners do to exploit the group's weaknesses? And you know, what factors motivate Syrians to join or support the Islamic State rather than other opposition groups? I mean, you mentioned they pay better. But I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense. And in Iraq, I asked the same question. You know, we're all well aware of Mr. Maliki's issues. The question is, you know, are the Shia militias under better control under the Abadi government? I mean, are we seeing the security forces being, you know, more restrained or better behaved? You know, and what steps can we do here or others to mitigate the appeal of the group?
I can take the question about Iraq.
Okay.
I would say that you asked specifically whether or not Shia militias are under better control now that Abadi is in power. Unfortunately, although I think that Prime Minister Abadi has the best of intentions, and he's definitely making the right noises when it comes to human rights reforms, he is not, the chain of command does not answer to him. He's not leading the military effort. The military effort is being led by the militias. The head of the Interior Ministry is a Badr militia commander. Same with the Human Rights Ministry. So unfortunately, no, there's no accountability for Shia militia abuses, and I don't think that it's within the power of Prime Minister Abadi to rein in the militias. That being said, what we think is the best option for the U.S. is to support Abadi's political reforms. Support humanitarian assistance, civilian protection as much as possible, while ceasing military assistance to Iraq until the government can show that it actually has control over the militias.
Yes, I think, you know, one of the voids that helped ISIS prosper in Syria is a political void. Because the ISIS came with presented a vision. I mean, it's not a vision that we like or approve of. if we are pro-democracy, but nevertheless, it's a vision, and it filled the void where the opposition, Syrian opposition, did not present the Syrian people with a vision of what Syria would look like as a political system and as a life in general after Assad. So this is something that I think could be targeted diplomatically, and the Syrian opposition could be encouraged to come together, unite, be more unified, and present a vision for the Syrian people. And such a vision will be also very important for the minorities, because at this time, the Syrian opposition has left the minorities for the regime, to be pro-regime because the regime offers security, and minorities' primary concern is their own security. So I think this is one way to fight ISIS, is to have have a vision for what Syria of the future look like. But meanwhile,
That's something the Syrians have to decide, right? I mean, that's not something that we can do. That's something that the Syrian people have to decide.
yes,
Right.
but we can encourage.
Right.
That's what I mean. The Syrian opposition meet always and try to lobby foreign governments and Western governments, and gets its legitimacy and recognition from Western government.
Mhm.
So you have a leverage over them, and I think you will be able to use it in a positive way. It will help in our goal to overcome ISIS. The other thing is that help ISIS is a prolonged conflict. The longer the conflict is, more people with economic needs might, join the ISIS to survive. And many people, like I know in my area in Hasaka, joined ISIS because there is a monthly salary. So that's another thing that we, can be focused on. And there are many other ways.
Thank you.
بداية دعنا نتحدث عن المرض ونبحث عن العلاج.
First, I think we should talk about the disease and then we should find the treatment.
سبب انتشار تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية أولاً هي جرائم نظام بشار الأسد الوحشية.
Well, first, the number one cause that led to the spread of ISIS is the brutality of the regime of Assad.
وثانياً المعارضة الفاسدة التي أعطت غطاء لهذا التنظيم المجرم.
Second is the corrupt opposition that had provided cover for this criminal regime.
وهنا حالة واحدة أتحدث عنها.
And there is one case here I would like to talk about.
في 9 من شهر حزيران عام 2013
On June 9, 2013,
عندما كان التنظيم يعرف بتنظيم الدولة الإسلامية في العراق والشام،
when the organization was called the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant,
قام هذا التنظيم بإعدام طفل بائع قهوة يبلغ من العمر 14 عاما.
this organization killed كم عمره?
14 سنة
A 14-year-old child
في
who
مدينة
was
حلب.
selling coffee in Halab city.
في حينها فقط المرصد السوري لحقوق الإنسان هو الذي تحدث عن هذه
And
الجريمة.
the only entity that spoke about this crime was the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights.
وهجمنا من قبل المعارضة المدعومة أمريكيا وعربيا لأننا تحدثنا عن هذه الجريمة.
And the opposition attacked us. This opposition, which is supported by the United States and also internationally, attacked us because we spoke about this.
قتل هذا الطفل لأنه اتهموه بالكفر ولم يكفر.
They killed this child because they accused him of infidelity, and he was not an infidel.
وأيضا فساد المعارضة المدعومة عربيا وغربيا
And also the opposition, which is corrupt and which is supported by Arab
استفاد منها
partners
تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية.
and the United States. This
رأينا
benefited ISIS.
في دير الزور هناك كتائب ما يعرف بالجيش الحر
In Deir ez-Zor, there are brigades of what is called the Free Army.
بايعت تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية.
They pledged allegiance to ISIS.
لذلك الحلول السريعة
That is why the quick solutions
وقف قتل النظام وإجرام النظام بحق أبناء الشعب السوري فورا
are to immediately stop the murderous regime
ودعم معارضة تؤمن بالديمقراطية.
and to support an opposition that is supportive of democracy.
والأهم هو رعاية الطفولة
But more important than this is to take care of children
في المخيمات
in camps,
في مناطق المعارضة.
in opposition areas.
السيد الرئيس،
Mr. Chairman,
هل تعلم أن في معسكرات تنظيم الدولة الإسلامية ما يعرف بأجبال الخلافة
Do you know that in the camps of ISIS, what is called Ashbal of the Caliphate,
يمارسون ما هو يعرف بغسيل الدماغ على الأطفال
they practice what is called as brainwash against children.
ويعرضون أفلام لجرائم النظام بحق الطفولة.
And they also show movies of the regime's crimes against children.
بالإضافة إلى الدعم المالي يستقطبون الأطفال.
In addition to this, of course, there is financial support, but through this way, they recruit children.
ومنعوهم من التعليم وقاموا بتدريسهم مناهج إسلامية متطرفة.
They denied them from good education and they subjected them to extremist educational
لذلك
systems.
دعم أي معارضة سورية يجب أن تكون مؤمنة بالديمقراطية وحماية كافة مكونات الشعب السوري.
That means that any opposition that is to be supported has to be supportive of democracy and pluralism.
غارات التحالف الدولي كان لها فعالية بكوباني.
Allied strikes were effective on Kobani
وساهمت بشكل كبير جدا.
and greatly contributed.
على الرغم من أنها تأخرت
Despite the fact that they were late,
إلى أن وصل التنظيم إلى داخل مدينة كوباني.
to the point that the ISIS got inside Kobani.
Thank you. Mr. Berry?
Just one last quick point. You know, if we trace this back to the origin, it's the Russian and Chinese governments blocking UN Security Council action.
Right.
And that leads to a broader macro level issue that probably wouldn't move quickly enough for these crises, but might be worth the U.S. Congress taking up, which is the question of whether or not a permanent member of the UN Security Council should be able to have an absolute veto, or whether or not veto power should be removed in the context of grave crimes, human rights violations and grave crimes. And that's something that's obviously would be a vast challenge in terms of changing the UN Security Council, but it could be raised over the medium to long term to begin that global conversation.
No, I appreciate that, and look, I mean, you know, I think based on Mr. Maybe Rami's answer, it points out how complicated the situation is, and one of the things I think that's really important for us in the international community is to, you know, there's this kind of impulse to do whatever you can to support anyone who's against ISIS, which we all think ISIS is horrible, but there are some people that are exploiting this kind of moment who, quite frankly, don't deserve to be supported because they're not going to promise necessarily a better future for the people that are right now are in a very difficult situation, and so it's you know, and I think that hearings like this are really important so people understand, you know, that this is not just there's no simple answers to this, and I think your issue about the United Nations, I think, is something that you know, I've thought about as well. I mean, I think the international community needs to take a better and a more upfront role in dealing with these kinds of situations around the world, and it can't just be, you know, the United States, and quite frankly, we need to find ways to empower the United Nations and to get them to be a better force on behalf of advocating for human rights and ending these conflicts. And I'll just end the way I began. You know, we have the short-term issue of people who are, you know, caught in the middle of this terrible conflict, but the only long-term answer, you know, are inclusive governments and governments that respect the rights of their people. And, you know, and so, and I'm going to say this, I think, you know, our history in this country has oftentimes been, you know, we'll support whoever is the enemy of our enemy. And then we end up having the enemy of our enemy take over, and it's not a good situation. And so I think we need to understand that as we move this. And I you know, we all watch the Sunday talk shows and stuff, and everybody has a quick answer to everything. You know, ISIS was able to go into Syria and into Iraq the way it did because of some lousy governance. They were able to take advantage of a vacuum that existed, and actually find some support amongst people who we all wish would have known better. But that's just the reality. And what I worry about is if we don't get serious about this issue of, you know, trying to support more inclusive governments in the region, it's not going to just be Iraq and Syria. You're going to have other countries that are going to have this same problem, and we're going to end up, having these discussions about these terrible human rights abuses and these terrible conflicts. So we may have some additional questions that would like to submit in writing to you, if that's okay. But I appreciate all your testimony and all your patience here today, and so I thank you very much for being here.
I also want to thank you so much. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being a part of this today. I've just got a few questions. First, address it to Mr. Berry, if that's all right. How do we've heard quite a bit about how much of what had been happening in Syria really led to the position that we're in, but how do the human rights abuses by the Islamic State in Syria compare to those committed by the regime?
It's difficult to do a simple number count, but with the regime, there's 4 years now of crimes against humanity with the government of Syria, the armed forces of the government of Syria, and it's against that backdrop that the Islamic State came into the region. So the bulk of the human rights violations continue to be from the government of Syria and its actions, though many people have also suffered and died in the context of Islamic State, as well as the 1,500 armed groups. 200,000 people have been killed in Syria over the last 4 years. And so it began before Islamic State came into the scene.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Evers, you touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more, just for my understanding. And it was mentioned in the past you've written about sectarian rule of the Maliki government and alienation of Sunni tribes. Many of the Sunni groups that led the awakening councils that defeated al-Qaeda are now backing the Islamic State. Can you help me understand a little bit more how the United States and our allies can turn these groups back against the Islamic State? What are some other thoughts that you might have of what else we could do there?
That's a really good question. I think the unfortunate reality is that a lot of the tribes that participated in the awakening are kind of permanently distrustful of both the United States and the Iraqi governments because of what happened after the civil war. When Maliki, did not make good on his promise to incorporate them into security forces, to pay them regular salaries, and instead started to arrest and execute them. And the U.S. essentially left them to their fates, turned a blind eye to that situation. The one kind of thing that I think the U.S. has on its side in trying to re-enfranchise these tribes is their desperation, frankly, because we've seen a number of tribes now in Iraq, of Sunni tribes, taking up the fight against ISIS by themselves, without any military support from the Iraqi government or from the international community. And I think the number of these tribes is spreading as the fighting spreads. Excuse me. What can the U.S. do to, specifically to re-enfranchise these tribes? I think a lot of it has to do with language and presentation. So long as the U.S. is seen as supporting sectarian Shiite militias in their military effort, then Sunni tribes are going to continue to be alienated by the U.S. I also think that we need to engage with the right people. To my knowledge, for example, the committee of tribal leaders that came to the U.S., I think it was 2 months ago, was really a committee of men, of tribal sheikhs who are not at all representative in the community. And so I think that U.S. leaders need to get better counsel on who is actually representative in the Sunni community, to the extent that, to be fair, it's, the representation, Maliki and ISIS together have done an excellent job destroying that political and military representation of Sunnis. But to the extent that there are still Sunni leaders on the ground with somewhat clean hands and with legitimacy, more importantly, we need to be engaging them, and I don't think we're engaging the right people. Maybe we can talk a little bit, through writing on who those people might be.
That'd be great. How important do you think that is for a positive outcome there, for us to engage with them? Do you see them as a key part of hopeful success.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, this idea about the National Guard law, which I don't know if you've heard about, but the idea is essentially, it was initially in order to bring Sunni tribes back into the fight so that Shia militias would not dominate the fight against ISIS. Unfortunately, the militias, who are now also political leaders, essentially said, well, if we're going to pass this law, then we're going to be part of it too. And so now what appeared to be a really positive development and something that would bring Sunnis back into the fold threatens to be just a legitimization and legalization of militias as fighters that represent the government. So I think that we need to reconsider our support for the National Guard law. It's something that it's an idea that the U.S. Presented, and it's one that the U.S. is strongly backing, but I think that it's going to end up on the ground cementing a really, really bad status quo.
Thank you. A couple more questions, if I may. Mr. Rami Abdelrahman, if I could briefly get your thoughts. Can you tell us about efforts to implement justice once a regime is taken, let me start over again. Can you tell us about efforts to implement justice once a region is taken back from IS? Are there any efforts to establish truth commissions, prosecutions, or reparations by any government or other entity once IS has been pushed back?
نعم. بداية طبعا نحن نشكر تسليط الضوء على الملف السوري بشكل أساسي هنا في هذا الجلسة.
Yes, first I would like to thank you for shedding light on the Syrian case in general in this hearing.
دعنا نقول أن إذا كانت هناك مناطق آمنة خارج سيطرة داعش.
Let's say that if we establish an area, a safe area that is out of the control of ISIS,
ويوجد فيها حكومة ديمقراطية.
where there is a democratic government,
يجب أن نبدأ بمحاكمات
then we must start prosecutions
للمجرمين
against the criminals.
لأنه مجلس الأمن يتعذر عليه إحالة الملف إلى محكمة الجنايات الدولية.
Because the Security Council would say that the cases should be brought before the International Criminal Court.
لكن في ذات الوقت هنا ملاحظة بسيطة.
But I would like to make a simple observation here,
ويعرفها السيد بسام.
and Mr. Bassam knows it.
عندما تقدمت الوحدات الكردية بمساعدة التحالف الدولي
When the Kurdish units provided assistance to the coalition, international coalition,
في تل حميث بريف الحسكة
in the suburbs of Al-Hasaka,
خرج عضو قيادي في الائتلاف
a leader in the coalition came out and said,
ونشر أكاذيب أن الوحدات الكردية تقوم بمجازر إبادة جماعية ضد العرب.
and promoted lies that the Kurdish units are perpetrating crimes against Arabs.
هذا الأمر خلق حساسية بتقدم الوحدات.
This created a sensitivity when it comes to the movements
لذلك
of the
هذه
units.
الأصوات لا تخدم الديمقراطية.
That is why I'm saying that these voices do not serve
وتذهب
the
كل الجهود
cause. So all
إلى
efforts are wasted.
القضاء على هذا التنظيم.
All the efforts that are deployed to get rid of the organization are just wasted.
Thank you. Let me ask one more question, if I can address it to Mr. Bassam Ashak. The Assad government has sought to portray itself as the sole protector of religious minorities in Syria, pointing to IS abuses as an indication that minorities would not be safe in a Syrian government by opposition groups. Have moderate Syrian oppositionists taken sufficient steps to ensure the rights of religious and ethnic minorities in a post-Assad Syria?
Actually, this has been part of my struggle with the Syrian opposition from early on when they started the Syrian National Council, to make them more sensitive to the needs of the Syrian minority and to help them better appeal to Syrian minorities. But they ignored this topic. There is a sort of unfortunate feeling of superiority. It is very unfortunate because I know the Muslim Sunnis, they're good people of Syria. I just want to help them to do a better job and be more sensitive to the minority, which will help serve all Syrians' goal of having more democratic Syria. So the example that just Mr. Rami spoke of, where the spokesman of the coalition, which is recognized by the US and by Western countries as the representative of the Syrian people, is making statements that is not truthful. So We need to have an example in the opposition of pluralism, of inclusion, and so far it's not there.
I said that was going to be my last question. One more, if I could, and really just following up on what my friend Congressman McGovern had asked a little bit about, but really getting back to Islamic State's greatest vulnerabilities or weaknesses, and what can we do, U.S. or coalition partners do to exploit those weaknesses ultimately for the benefit of the region?
Well, I think we have to start working on this long-term solution from now. We have to fight this ideology. And I've had experiences where we did workshops for diverse groups from Hasaki region, where we had Arabs and we had Kurdish participants, Syriac participants, and talked about principles of pluralism, of inclusion, social justice, and it was very, very good, you know.
Well received.
Yeah, so well received and gave very good results and mended lots of differences and helped us actually draft a social contract, which eventually became a real social contract for Hasaki. So I think we need to work in that direction because ISIS abuses this void of a pluralistic, democratic, inclusive ideology.
Well, again, I want to thank the witnesses for testifying here today. I'd also like to thank them for their contributions in the field of human rights. As we consider an organization like the Islamic State and its place when assessing human rights, our government must hold a proper perspective. Terrorism is not simply an unfortunate plot on the continuum of human rights outcomes. Terrorism and the groups that commit terrorism, and especially the Islamic State, represent the apex of human rights violations. We are witnessing a complete breakdown of the human rights climate when we see a group like the Islamic State gain territory, take control, and expand its influence. Most especially, the Islamic State's theology precludes any notion of internationally respected human rights or universal recognized human rights norms. It cannot see, tolerate, or respect anything outside its narrow worldview. I do personally disagree with the Obama administration's claim that the group is not Islamic. It is a narrow, extreme, and intolerant version of Islam, but it is Islamic nonetheless. We must come to terms with this. However, I do agree with one assessment made by the president. The Islamic State is indeed a death cult. It worships death. Murder and the ensuing death that it causes represents the polar opposite of respect for the basic human rights of another individual. Each act of violence perpetrated by the Islamic State actually constitutes the violation of many human rights and not a single violation. With every murder of an innocent being, as we've heard about more today, that individual's right to assemble, their right to speak freely, their right to worship their creator, all of these rights are violated, and not just their right to live freely. I believe this is why the Islamic State turns to death as their final outcome. It cannot respect the rights of those that do not adhere to its narrow way of life. Other ways of life are a threat to it. I believe our government must support solutions that therefore bolster freedom. Any effort to degrade and destroy the Islamic State must also include ample efforts in building and bolstering respect for the rights of people. I look forward to joining with my colleagues here and others throughout Congress and working with this commission to make sure that that happens. Again, I want to thank you for your time, thank you for your work, and look forward to working together to see some positive outcomes here. So again, thank you all. With that, the commission is adjourned.